In the spring session of Parliament, that's traditionally the time we have a budget. This spring was no exception. We had the budget for 2013. The interesting thing about this budget is, I think it's the first time in the history of Canada that Parliament had tabled before us a budget with no numbers. It was very hard. You know, I'm serious. It had numbers. Well, there were page numbers for one thing. There were individual references to spending. Now, I'm not trying to be facetious about it, but you know, Kevin Page, who was our first parliamentary budget officer, has made the point very forcefully that the public purse, the responsibility for the public purse, rests with Parliament, and that in his opinion, parliamentarians do not have enough information about the fiscal health of the country or the budgets that get passed to actually pass them or not. And I have to say, I certainly agree with Kevin Page, but this budget, when I'm used to going to budget lockups, I've done them for years. I did them before I was ever elected. In the old days, pre-Mr. Harper, non-government organizations, and I was with Sierra Club, we were allowed into what was called lockup. So you could read the budget and digest it before the finance minister rose to speak. And obviously because of budget secrecy, there's a reason that you'd be locked up. You go in, you surrender your cell phone at the door, and read the budget over a period of a couple of hours. And then you get to go out and try to explain what you think of it, praise the parts you like, criticize the parts you don't like, and so on. They don't any longer let environmental groups or development groups or other groups in lockup. But it means that I have a certain technique for reading budgets. I've been doing it for, well, certainly 15 years. So one of the things I always do is go to the back of the budget first and look for the summaries of what spending is going to take place department by department. And that was what was missing this year. So you couldn't figure out the total spending for any department, nor could you compare the total spending to any department to previous years. We couldn't begin to do that until we got to main estimates. And unfortunately, main estimates don't get debated in the House anymore. They have a very strange procedure of assuming that they should be passed immediately without scrutiny. So I've got some problems with the level of control or knowledge that we have as members of Parliament. In any case, the budget led to an omnibus budget bill. This one was not as devastating as C-38 and C-45 from the 2012 budget, but budget 2013 did lead to this omnibus budget bill C-60, which is one of the many bills passed in the spring session of Parliament. And what happened in terms of my activities, I think probably most of you will know that I found a rule that no other MP had ever noticed that said that members of Parliament who weren't members of a committee could actually go, could present amendments at the report stage of the bill, which is when the Parliament as a whole is assembled, and you vote all of Parliament on amendments at report stage. So I found this rule that said I could do that, and that's how I had, what was it, 400 and some amendments to C-38. Well, you may not be surprised to hear that Mr. Van Loan, the Conservative Government House Leader, doesn't like it when I put forward amendments. So in the fall of 2012, this was one of my better moments of the last year, happier moments, was that in the fall of 2012, Peter Van Loan, Conservative House Leader, made a motion to the Speaker of the House that was specific to me. This is rather unusual. That the Member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands should not be allowed to put forward these amendments. Yeah. And the Speaker said, well, what Peter Van Loan said was he proposed as an alternative that whenever I brought forward amendments, they should take one as sort of a test amendment and put it to a vote. And if it was defeated, then none of the other amendments should be heard. Yeah. Now, the Speaker of the House gave a very good ruling in response to that. But unfortunately, he left Mr. Van Loan some wiggle room. So the good part that I was happy about last fall was he said, in a parliamentary democracy, every member of Parliament has a right to contribute to the development of legislation. And a member of Parliament who's not a member of committee, this is where I found this strange rule, if a member of Parliament isn't a member of committee, they have a right to bring forward amendments at report stage. And the Speaker of the House further said, which was great news, and I think every Canadian should have had this good news. The Speaker of the House said this is a democracy. You don't hear that a lot, but anyway, and he said, I don't hate to be facetious about, but it really is, where our democracy is hanging by a thread. But Speaker Scheer said this is a democracy, and he said to me privately, he said, you know, it would be ridiculous. It would be as if we have a speech from the throne, and from then on, there was no point doing anything else because the Conservatives have the majority, everything's going to pass that they want, nothing that they don't want is going to pass, so why hear from any of the opposition members? I mean, that's the logical extension of what Peter Van Loan was saying. Anyway, part of what Speaker Scheer's ruling that I was very happy that he ruled that I was allowed to continue to put forward my amendments at report stage. But he said, as long as there is no other opportunity for the member of Saanich Gulf Islands or members in her position to put forward amendments to legislation, then you can't shut down her rights at report stage. So they went to the drawing board and they figured out how to give me a so-called opportunity. And what happened on Bill C-60, the omnibus budget bill this year, was that the Finance Committee sent me an invitation that I was invited to submit my amendments to them first. Since I'm not a member of the committee, I couldn't actually table my own amendments. They wouldn't give me temporary committee membership, that would have been better. But they would deem my amendments to have been tabled and presented, and they allowed me 1 minute per amendment to explain the purpose of the amendment and speak to it. But I wasn't allowed to respond to questions from other members or entry. I had Scotty Bryson from the Liberal Party said, oh, I like this amendment, but I'd like to suggest a friendly amendment. And he turned to me and said, is that friendly? And the chair wouldn't let me answer. I had my minute. Right? So it was a very odd process. Now, unfortunately, I did try putting forward amendments at report stage, and I did a long point of order as to why the opportunity I'd had in the committee wasn't a satisfactory or equal opportunity to other members, and therefore should preclude my ability to put forward amendments at report stage. I won't go into all the details, just to say that the Speaker didn't rule with me. So I spent a lot of the spring running from committee to committee. Somehow all the chairs of all the committees all at once decided to invite me. So I was going from committee to committee. Sometimes they were sitting at the same time. So I'd run from one committee meeting after the ritual slaughter of my amendments to go forward to another committee for the and I actually missed one where I raced in the door and I was just seconds too late for my amendments to the bill that has well, that's a very sad bill that got passed by unanimous consent, by the way. All the parties worked on this one to allow seismic testing inside the new Sable Island National Park and directional drilling under it. So, the spring session of Parliament, just to add one other thing that happened, which is why the prorogation this time is actually normal, is that the government House leader put forward a motion, which of course Conservatives voted for, that we were going to sit till midnight every night starting May 20th till Parliament adjourned at the end of June. This was initially, as far as I'm concerned, a tactic to try to get the opposition parties to agree to an early adjournment so people could go back earlier in the summer. There was initially talk that we were going to adjourn in mid-June. But if there was a serious effort to find a compromise for adjournment, the problem was that none of these parties trust each other enough to admit that they all want to go home for the summer. They're all poised waiting to say, we were here ready to work and you wanted to go home for the summer. So nobody would meet in the middle. Now, I didn't care. I didn't think we should go home early for the summer. I was fine with it. But I was the only member of Parliament who was there every night till midnight. The other parties, as you probably know, work on shifts. So there had to be just sort of a bare minimum quorum in the room. So it was a very tiring month for me. And in the month, the last month, May 20th to June 20th, 19 government bills got royal assent, 16 government bills got through third reading. So that means and some of them started and went through all stages through the month of May and June. So we'd go through second reading, debate, report stage, third reading, all in a period of days. And they also applied time allocation to every bill. So in terms of debate, all debates were abbreviated. So sitting till midnight, sometimes if any one stage earlier in the day ran late, a midnight adjournment happened at 1:30 in the morning. And this was, of course, this didn't include Fridays, but Monday to Thursday, we sat to a minimum of midnight every night. Basically, they cleared their calendar. There's almost nothing left on the order paper of government bills. Mr. Harper got every single bill that he would have cared about passed, plus a lot they didn't care about much. It was frustrating because on some of these bills, all of us in the opposition supported the government bill. There's some that were just so, let's see, the Safer Witnesses Act. This was a C-51, just as an example. It was a bill to provide better protection to people who were testifying in a criminal matter where they were under some threat. A better protection of witnesses before a trial. Nobody was opposed to it. But we still have the same formulaic debate where we had to have, so in some cases, you wanted, like on C-60, which was a lot of bills put together, the omnibus budget bill, the issue that probably people in this room may care the most about, there were two that I think were really critically damaging about C-60. None of them affected the environment, but one was interfering with collective bargaining of Crown corporations, which specifically affects CBC, as well as Via Rail, a lot of Crown corporations. But what it said was the political side of government can appoint someone to sit in the room during the collective bargaining and actually insist on the management side of negotiations, reporting through so the government could control terms of work and conditions of work. In the case of CBC, terms and conditions of work can include the assignments that journalists get, where they're posted, how much staff they have if they're in the field. There was a group letter from every eminent retired Canadian journalist to the committee to say, don't let this happen. Joe Schlesinger and Don Newman and a whole roster of prominent journalists. Patrick Brown, who used to be CBC's China reporter, who's one of my constituents now because he lives on Pender. But all of these very eminent journalists said this is wrong in principle. You don't have political interference in collective bargaining for the CBC. The other piece of C-60 that was worrying was changing the tax treatment of credit unions to make it much harder for credit unions to compete with commercial banks. So there were other little wrinkles in there. I presented amendments. Oh, one of the things that happened in C-60, I shouldn't gloss over, was the elimination of CEDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, as a standalone agency, and folding its operations in to the Department of Foreign Affairs. There were a number of pieces to C-60 because it was your usual omnibus 400-page kind of bill. But the majority of it was changes to the tax code that were non-controversial. And then there were these pieces I've mentioned, plus a few others. So C-60, all of the bills that were passed through the month of May and June really cleared the agenda. That one I would have liked to have debated longer, as I was mentioning, the debates on the bills that everyone agreed on. I would have liked to say, and I did sometimes have my question to, why are we debating this? If we could put this to a vote right now, every single member of Parliament in this place and every party in this place supports this bill, so why don't we pass this bill now and give ourselves some more time to debate the bills that are controversial? That was not well received. Yeah. So that was the session of Parliament that brought us to the end of June. It was a rough, I have to say, it was a rough session. Physically rough, and also there were some, the saddest bill for me to see passed was the one that I've mentioned about seismic testing and directional drilling on Sable Island, creating a national park that allows the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board to have superior regulatory powers in a national park, superior to Parks Canada. And it is a dangerous precedent, and I was devastated by that one, and it happened right at the very end of the session. So now we have had the news that there's going to be prorogation. The normal use of prorogation, and other prime ministers have always prorogued, if they have come to a point where the speech from the throne agenda that they put forward has pretty much run out of steam, and it's time for a new speech from the throne and new legislation. The one piece, I'll leave you with some good news, and then I'll open it for questions. I think a lot of you will know that I've put forward a private member's bill for a national Lyme disease strategy. I'm now in, at least when we adjourned, and I don't think any private members' bills and positions of private members' bills are protected during prorogation. In other words, I don't slide back to the beginning. If it was a government bill on the order paper and there's prorogation, those bills slide back to the beginning and have to start over. But it's understood in principle that for a private member's bill to get anywhere near debate and second reading, they hold position even when the House prorogues. So my bill is now slated to be fourth up whenever we get back to the House. And I'm hoping, and I'm just so hoping, because last I checked in with a lot of people, I think I've got the votes for it to pass. A lot of conservatives support my bill. So unless they're told they can, and it's because they have a lot of people in their communities with Lyme disease who want this bill to pass. So I'm cautiously optimistic that I can get that bill passed before, well, it'd be nice to have it passed before 2014, but who knows? We don't know when we're going back for sure. Now there may be, I know there's a lot of concerns that people will have about what's going on in Syria, other questions you may have about the press conference, Andrew Weaver, and I saw Adam Olson come in earlier. Adam and Andrew and I had a press conference yesterday on the material about how much money is being spent in the federal government in support, so as we view it, in support of the Enbridge project. But I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has. I'll attempt to give briefer answers than I usually do because I'm bad at that, and then we'll get more questions in. So I'm very grateful again. Thank you all for coming, and I'll try to spot hands, and if I'm not seeing you, because there are a lot of people here, yes, Carolyn, you go first.
Thank you. Can you name companies which are in the green tech sector which should be supported to gradually replace the coal, oil, and gas sector? Some financial planners are prepared to divest from the petrol sector and move money to sustainable development businesses.
Thank you, Carolyn. The list is, did that question carry to the back? Okay. The question was, can I name companies in the clean tech, green tech sector that can replace oil, coal, and gas? And there are financial managers looking for places to divest from fossil fuel investments and start investing in a newer and greener economy. There are so many. It's a wonderful and burgeoning field. As things now stand, Canada only has, well, globally, it's at the moment, it's a $3 billion, no, it's $60 billion globally. Canada has $1 billion of that. And the Pembina Institute study said that by 2020, if we put our minds to it, we could increase that to $3 billion. So that would be healthy for our economy. It doesn't mean that you have to shut down all your fossil fuel operations, but we should be diversifying our investments. We have quite a few right here in the riding. Near the airport in the industrial park, there's a very strong wind energy company called Aeolus Wind. It's got a very big development in the Peace region, northern British Columbia. It's working on developing a methanol that would be a fuel that burns without carbon, and so they're very green and developing right in the region. There are so many individual companies, I hate to go out naming them. There's a lot of really exciting work going on in tidal energy. There are low-flow tidal devices, basically like, if you can picture almost like a piece of pipe, the fish could swim through it, but in the circular inside of the pipe, the rings of magnets, which collect the energy from the tide as it goes in and out. The tidal energy industry is, I think right now, Nova Scotia wants to invest a lot in it. But I know from the Vancouver Island Institute of Technology right here that there are companies doing work in low-flow tidal. They're actually generating electricity. And if we could get BC Hydro to agree to buy electricity from them. BC Hydro does not have the system that Ontario Hydro has of what are called feed-in tariffs that allow a renewable energy company to know they're going to get a certain price per megawatt, certain price, that helps them invest and build, but also it helps the utility have a diversified range of sources. The green tech, clean tech field is huge. Basically renewables, photovoltaics, I haven't mentioned that, roofing tiles. They're now so thin, you just get like a layer across your roof that actually can give you all the electricity needs for your house from photovoltaic roofing tiles. There are also some really cool, there's a company that's promoting solar photovoltaic. See, the difference between, most people think about solar. Solar's great for a home where you plan with passive solar, and you say, okay, where's my south-facing wall, and I don't want to be shaded on that side. And actually, the biggest utility in California, PG&E, has a whole team of landscapers who will go out to a person's home and help them figure out where they want their trees and where they don't want their trees. Because PG&E has figured out that a unit of energy saved is just as valuable as a unit of energy bought. So they've done a lot in pioneering, encouraging consumer choice in more energy efficient refrigerators. I think the most creative thing is that they'd actually go to a home and say, here's where your trees should go, so you can reduce your air conditioning costs and reduce your winter heating costs. This is what we're recommending. This is how you should site your house. That's passive solar. Photovoltaics, in case anyone doesn't know, they actually convert directly sunlight into electricity. That's how you can have photovoltaic roofing tiles that actually produce all the electricity you need in your home. And if you have a very sunny day, you can sell it. In some jurisdictions, you just sell from your home out to the grid. The new one that I saw recently, it's very hard to keep up with all of them. I was really excited about this one. The price is down on photovoltaics. The price keeps coming down. One of the biggest reasons, the big bulk development of photovoltaics right now is in China. But this cool one that I saw the other day online, they look like little flowers. They're revolving photovoltaic petals, if you could imagine that. So they capture the sun in all kinds of directions very efficiently and convert it directly to electricity. So the only hurdle that we have in having renewables totally replace coal, oil, and gas is the problem of storage. Because there's way more solar energy than human economies need to run everything off solar. The problem is everybody who wants to criticize solar energy will point out to you very quickly, is what do you do when it's raining? What do you do when the sun's not shining? Same thing for wind. What do you do when the wind's not blowing? They don't have that problem with tidal because that's kind of constant. Well, the gap that we have to fill is to figure out how we store the excess from when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, how to store it so it becomes baseload power. So there's enough stored in something. There are many competing technologies. As soon as we break through with the storage solution, fossil fuels are going to be extinct because we're not going to need them because this other source is cheaper. So I know I said I was going to give short answers, but I'll just finish. The former Secretary of Energy in the U.S., Stephen Chu, who's a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, I heard him speak at the Copenhagen climate meetings, and you could see he was so excited about what he regarded as some of as the U.S. Secretary of Energy, he put a lot of money into certain things that were, fairly conventional, like photovoltaic roofing tiles and wind, But where he got really excited was his long shot investment. If he could get a manganese-based battery instead of, he said battery technology and research on batteries has pretty much stalled over a couple decades. We got our batteries, we were happy, we didn't keep pushing the technology. He said, if you had a swimming pool-sized magnesium battery, you could power a city. Now, he's a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, so I thought that was exciting news. That may or may not ever work. The other things that other countries are doing, Holland, the Netherlands, is investing a lot in storage from their wind energy, which they have a lot of. And sometimes wind energy can get so as it gets to be a bigger part of your electrical grid. You have a problem because if it's really windy, you can actually sort of blow your whole grid. So you have to make sure it's not, you have to store it. So the Netherlands is working on compressed air storage. Another storage potential is using the energy from wind or solar or whatever to produce hydrogen. And then your hydrogen becomes your storage. But in the mix of all of this is so much exciting potential. And the sad news is that Canada is losing out on this because we're not investing. Anyway, I'm sorry, Cal, that was so long.
We need something positive.
We do need something positive, and fortunately, there's a lot out there. And the good news is that when you look at the International Energy Agency reports, you'll see, last year was the breakthrough year for installed wind and solar. They
Can we
began
stop
to
the
lose money
stink?
as companies, but they still broke through. Yeah.
Can we stop the stink? I think that's why you've got a great crowd here.
Yeah, can I stop what?
The stink.
Talking about the composting in Central Saanich.
Oh, okay, so that'll be right. Okay, I'll go to back there and there. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
My name is Lauren Underwood. I'm from the Salem First Nation. I appreciate you mentioning the establishment of federal parks and what is taking place on Sable Island. With the establishment of paper parks in Canada, so many were inaccessible to the average Canadian. And from a First Nations perspective, I don't know what the drive has been for the last 10 or 15 years to establish these paper parks. I've always thought that it was resource extraction at some point was going to take place within those park boundaries. The main reason that it concerns me is that it takes land away from First Nations people through a legitimate process. The other thing is the run of the river. I thank you for mentioning that. A lot of First Nations have bought into run of the river power. And now the government's, BC Hydro in particular, is saying that it's not affordable. They can't afford to buy it back from Run of the River. So you can have all these green technologies, but there's nothing to guarantee that you sell it back to them. So there's a whole lot of policy issues that need to come into play. I think that to protect those sustainable power sources, that has to come and be driven by the citizens, I guess, in a democracy. But we're not in a democracy. We're in a republic. Canada is a republic. We're the assembly of the United States, which is also a republic. And that's why I'm here tonight, is because I see our democracy is in jeopardy right now. We're in the 11th hour of losing a very beautiful country, becoming a warmongering republic. So the last thing I'll mention is that as coming from Salem First Nation, I have serious concerns about environmental issues. And now Stephen Harper's government is undermining First Nations as the last line of defense for protection of the environment by limiting our Section 35 rights under the Constitution. And nobody's talking about it. Jack Woodward from Woodward came to us, had a meeting at our band. He said, you know what, you're the last line of defense now for the environment in Canada, First Nations. So I was wondering if there's anything, I looked at the petitions and I don't see anything relating back to First Nations about the stripping away of Section 35 rights in the Constitution. If we are the last line of defense, we need some help to protect that Section 35 rights. Thank you.
I'm just checking, thank you, Adam. I was just thinking we needed to open some windows. How are people doing?
They're all over.
They're all open? Wide open. They're wide open. Well, there's this emergency exit. Does a bell go off if we open this door? Just checking. Just a sec. Oh, no, it just goes to a staircase. You all knew that. Okay. Well, first of all, I thank you for your question, and I'm sorry that I didn't begin tonight by acknowledging that we are on the territory of the Saanich peoples, and we appreciate the enormous welcome and with gratitude, the generosity of Saanich peoples in having so many of us newcomers sharing territory. You're right about particularly on Sable Island National Park. The Mi'kmaq First Nation was not properly consulted at all and submitted that they had not been properly consulted. The Run of the River projects are, they were very controversial. I don't think that the Campbell government did it exactly the right way to engage with renewables, but having engaged with them, they should, no community, First Nations or not, or investor that went down that road based on a government promise should be left with clean renewable energy at a price that they can't recoup their investment. That's outrageous. So we have to look at that. And in terms of our democracy, I do think it's hanging by a thread. But we do have the opportunity to have a viable democracy in Canada if we could just help the rest of Canada to see what needs to be done. When I finish the round of town hall meetings in Saanich Gulf Islands this September, within the next 2 weeks, because we're going to be prorogued until probably mid to late October, I'm just going to keep the town hall meetings going across Canada. So I'm going to be in Halifax and Moncton and Montreal, and sessions just like this, Calgary, Winnipeg, Whitehorse, I'm forgetting all the places we're going to, Ottawa, Toronto. One of the things that I want to try to share with all Canadians, and I think you all know this, but that what's strangling the life out of democracy is organized political parties and the power of organized political party leaders. The ability to tell a member of parliament, you vote the way I tell you to vote, you say what I tell you to say, keep your mouth shut. If you want to know where the numbers are, don't worry about it, I've got it handled. So the power of the Prime Minister's office is supplanting Parliament. The Prime Minister's office is running everything. And regardless of who the Prime Minister is in that office, that's wrong. So even and that's what worries me too, is that, people can be for or against Mr. Harper's policies, but whoever replaces him will have those powers. And it worries me. I don't really think that Tom Mulcair or Justin Trudeau are going to go into their offices at Langevin Block, if they're the Prime Minister at the end of the next election, and say, oh my goodness me, I have too much power. I must divest myself of all this wonderful power that lets me make all the decisions, hire, fire, bully MPs, muzzle scientists, end programs I don't like. They don't have to go before the House of Commons to make major changes. And so if we can talk about what Westminster parliamentary democracy is supposed to be, then we can get it back. And one of the fundamental things that I hope, I can never do my job to everybody's satisfaction within the riding, but one of my goals is that I represent Saanich Gulf Islands as my major priority, and my role politically for the Green Party is secondary. To me, it's well secondary. So my job, as I see it, is representing Saanich Gulf Islands in Parliament, working for my constituents in my constituency office as hard as we can with a great, great team that works very hard. Janet Cram is here. She's on my constituency staff. We knock ourselves out as much as we can to help people who have problems. And then down the road, the third thing down is building a party, because it's much more important to have Canadians believe that their member of parliament could actually represent them again. And also, a ton of members of parliament feel the same way, but they're just not quite brave enough to stand up to their own leaders yet. And I appreciate also you mentioning that we need a petition on Section 35 rights. I will want to develop one. We have some First Nations related petitions available on our website, but not one that goes to the core of what you said, so we should develop that. So sorry for taking so long with that answer. Now, there were two, yes, I think you're next, was there? Yes.
Year 2000 and the year 2006, there were $100 billion in federal tax cuts. If the proceeds of those tax cuts had instead been put towards eliminating the national debt, it would have completely avoided a deficit, and even with the recession, eliminated the national debt by the end of the year 2012. Furthermore, about $200 billion in Canada savings bonds is owned by the CPP. If the government had paid the CPP back, that would have enabled the CPP to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in renewable energy and rail transport and such.
Look, may I ask your name, sir?
Boyd Deckers.
Thank you. Those were. I appreciate what you said so much, because it's one of those great. How do I put this? It's the triumph of spin over substance. That Mr. Harper's record has been portrayed as though he was a good manager of the economy. All of those tax cuts hurt us, because at the moment that we hit when the recession hit in 2008, we'd lost any surplus buffering capacity We were already in deficit before the 2008 financial meltdown occurred, and he's also become the biggest spending prime minister in the history. So this is, again, I refer to Kevin Page and his concerns about a structural deficit, where we've cut taxes, which is great. It's great to cut taxes if you cut taxes where they've been a burden, and preferably, our view is they should be shifted and put taxes on pollution and reduce taxes on people. But we could have done a great deal instead of basically just using those tax cuts as cheap promises to say, keep voting for me because I've cut taxes. And on the other hand, they keep producing these very strange, I mean, small c conservative principles should involve getting rid of debt. And small c conservative principles would also involve simplifying the tax code. And in the last number of years, they've made the tax code increasingly complex because they've wanted to provide what are generally referred to as boutique tax cuts. Like, if you have a kid in hockey and you make enough money that you're a taxpayer, you can get a rebate on your hockey equipment. You can get rebates if your son or daughter are in ballet, unless it's gender stereotype this. But you can't get that if your kids are in some other form of activity. So it's a very strange way. What we really want, I think what we really want, is to use tax dollars to ensure that the schools have enough money in terms of federal provincial transfer, that the schools can afford to keep the playgrounds open for everyone because they can afford to have some supervision after school. Sporting activities in this country have become something, athletics has become something that you can get if you pay for it, as opposed to what it used to be, which was sort of free for everybody because after school play let it happen. So that the sports issue for me is one small example of how cutting away at the tax base has actually converted society to more of a gap between the have and have-nots, and for something really fundamental like our kids' health. So I really appreciate the points you made. I don't think you really actually asked, I don't really need to say anything more except to applaud you for doing the great research to make that point. Now, where was the next hand? Yes.
I just wanted to know if you could just tell me about this. I heard a story this week about the fact that in order to encourage mining and mining companies who are trying to do their work overseas and in these particularly poor countries, that many of those countries are now saying, no, you leave too much of a mess, our water is being destroyed, and we don't want you here. So what the government of this country has done, it has encouraged now all these NGOs, Save the Children, CETA is gone, they are now encouraged to work with the mining companies to ensure that the people in the area where the mining companies want to do their work understand clearly that the mining companies will allow their children to have suckers and lollipops and ice cream and this kind of stuff. So much so that in Chile, and I don't know if it is, who's up in the north of Chile? Is it Barrick? No, I don't know who it is, but it's a big company, and they want to open further, and they've been told no. Mr. Harper went to Chile to speak to the Chilean government on behalf of this particular. Is this true? Is this what this man is doing?
Well, yes, CETA's mandate now, they've continued the development agency within the Department of Foreign Affairs. But the mandate of CETA has shifted from poverty alleviation to promotion of Canadian opportunities and poverty alleviation. So it was a pilot project with Barrick Gold and Rio Tinto and a bunch of big mining companies. And not every development organization agreed to work on this program. Oxfam refused, but World Vision went into a partnership. Now the money went to the NGOs, not to the large mining companies, but the notion of it, I think, is antithetical to the goals of CETA. If those companies want to provide money to development organizations to help them do community work, I don't think that's a problem. But I think if you use the limited amount of money that we have in aid dollars that's supposed to be for poverty alleviation, it shouldn't require twinning with Canadian corporations operating overseas. We should, those companies have enough money. If they want to do a project with World Vision or Save the Children, or any of the larger NGOs. They can do that. The other thing that's worried me about mining companies too has been, and this is in general, not just Canadian mining companies, but because of these investor-state treaties, there have been some very, very bad decisions. And this one does involve a Canadian mining company. Let me try to remember the name of all the companies involved. It was a suit in which Ecuador ended up losing billions of dollars in, and I don't know how many of you read the last householder that I mailed to every house with its description of investor-state treaties. This decision came in after that went out to the mails. But Ecuador, I think it was a landmark decision, and that I think Ecuador had a judgment against it for $7 billion. It was certainly in the billions. And what had happened is that they'd gone into a contract with a mining company, and under the terms of the contract, if that company sold any portion of its resource rights within Ecuador to another company without getting the permission of the Ecuadorian government, then that voided the contract. They weren't allowed to do that under contract law. I'll try to make this is a crazy story. The mining company, which was based in the US, sold a huge chunk of its resources to an Alberta company. So that's the only Canadian connection. So Ecuador said, you've just voided the contract, leave the country, our contract with you is over. And it was interesting because usually on these arbitration panels, which are just a couple of lawyers in a hotel room who make the decision, usually they all agreed. So it was rare to have a split decision. It was 2-1, so obviously the dissenting voice lost. The majority of the two people who were arbitrating this, who agreed with the company. They said it didn't matter that they agreed that in terms of the contract, the company violated the contract. They agreed that under the terms of the contract, the consequence of selling resources to a third-party company in Canada was to void the contract and give Ecuador the right to say you have to leave the country. But then they made this illogical leap and said, but under the circumstances, it was such an outrageous thing to throw them out of the country because they'd already invested so much money, you owe them $7 billion. So the smaller, weaker developing countries, if they're already in a situation with an investor-state agreement, vis-a-vis a Canadian mining company or a US mining company, they're in real trouble because they can't enforce their own laws without running the risk of one of these massive damage decisions against them. So the whole area, for those of you who are interested in mining issues, so I'll kind of stop talking about them, but there's a ton of good, reliable information, in my view, reliable information from a little non-government organization called Mining Watch Canada. So if these issues interest you and you want to look into them further, Mining Watch Canada is very focused on what Canadian mining companies are doing in the developing world. I did a tour the end of June. It's a big mistake because I was too exhausted to do it. But anyway, I went anyway. The Green Party of Greece asked me to come to Greece, to northern Greece, where two Canadian gold mines are threatening areas that don't want them. So I was just involved very much in the conflict. And I recognize that this particular Canadian mining company is far better than many of the others I've dealt with and really was trying to do a good job, but the local people don't want them. I had the funniest conversation, I shouldn't go off on, it was very funny actually. I was meeting with a local labor union, and everything's translated Greek to English, right? So I just toured this beautiful area called Thrace or Thrake. It's on the easternmost edge of Greece, quite close to Turkey. Beautiful area. Anyway, I toured the area, and they were all saying why they were against the gold mine. They didn't want the gold mine in a place called Parma. And then the union leader said, what we really want is oil. And he said, we want our oil. And it kept me translating. I said, I don't think I'm hearing it right. They were such good environmentalists a minute ago. We want our oil. And he said, we have a lot of oil. We make money on our oil. And I said, you have oil? Where? You saw it yesterday. All our oil. Olive oil! I said, not oil, okay. It was great meeting union leaders who wanted olive oil. Sorry. Who had a next question? Okay, sure. And I was watching. Did I miss somebody else back there? I feel like I did.
The issue of composting in your own writing. I sent you some, I'm ready, I'm confident, I sent you some pictures on it. And I just wondered if you looked into it at all, the pollution that it's causing. It's egregious, the pollution. In fact, a lot of people that are in this room tonight can attest to what terrible pollution.
Yeah.
And in fact, there was no environmental study as to whether or not this was an appropriate location, because farmers are allowed now to be our composters, waste management experts. There is no any kind of environmental study or checks and balances to make sure it's done green. Some of the major gases that are going off of this facility are greenhouse gases, such as nitrous oxide,
And methane.
methane,
Yeah.
yes, and ammonia, which once it lands on the land and lands on the water, transforms into the nitrous oxide. So we have a horrible amount of greenhouse gases going on. And there's a lot of people, you've heard a lot of coughing here tonight, who are already establishing respiratory issues and so on, and they want it attended to, and they were looking to you to see how you may assist in this.
Okay, thank you for the question, and how many of you are particularly concerned with this issue? Because I like getting the survey. A lot of people, and I'm not surprised. A lot of people, and I'm not surprised. Now, the only difficulty that I have with it, because I agree with you, is that it's not, I haven't found anything in that issue yet that gives me any federal jurisdiction. I can intervene if a composting facility was, say, contaminating a stream that had fish in it.
It is.
Okay, there's something. There's one municipal councillor in the room. I hate to, Brian, do you have any thoughts on? It's municipal jurisdiction and it's provincial jurisdiction. And one thing I can do as an MP, this is something I'm doing as soon as, I can try to bring together the different levels of government and see what we can sort out. That's a very informal role, because in terms of the House of Commons, it's not federal jurisdiction. And I don't want to, what we should be getting is, I shouldn't even finish the sentence because I'm about to criticize the province. In theory, to have a decent industrial scale composting facility, you need to make sure that it is absolutely top grade, best technology, and doesn't have, the best kind of composting actually won't have smell because it's done properly. But we've got an awful lot of developing composting that has been approved. Well, it seems to me let me just say, not as an MP, but as a community member, it seems to me they've been approved without going through enough review to make sure it wasn't going to make life intolerable for neighbors. Composting is a great idea, and a lot of times we'd be better off to be composting in our backyards rather than centralizing the operation. But we don't want to be creating, if you do composting right, you don't get methane. If you do composting right, you don't get the smell, because you're doing it in the presence of lots of oxygen. Where you get the problem is where it's left not turned adequately, not with enough oxygen. So I know that the CRD and the province and municipalities are going to have to deal with this. I will pursue it as best I can with other levels of government. I promise you that, because it's really, I know how much it's distressing for people who are anywhere near composting facilities that are creating.
Staying in the document and also within the time of the area. And I think on a federal level, I think it does belong to jurisdiction, because one of the people that are bringing food waste to the composting facility are cruise ships. So all the cruise ships arrive, truck picks them up and dumps all the food waste into the Central Saanich.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, as a Canadian, I'm at the U.S. border, I can't bring across an orange. From your apple to Canada.
Yeah.
How can a company, who we don't know where this food is coming from, it's on a cruise ship, it includes meat, it includes dairy, I don't know what else it includes, and it's being dumped on our land? How is that possible? And so I made some calls yesterday, and I was told that it's a Canadian border agency issue. And that somebody apparently should be inspecting this at the cruise ship.
Well, that's fascinating, because that may be something I can have a look at. Looking for the federal angle, there's not a federal angle on every issue. And I probably push the boundaries a bit much in getting into things that might not, because some MPs would have stopped before trying to answer the question because it's not our area. On the other hand, I hear you. You need help on this. I'll try to help every way I can. I saw a hand go up over there. Who was going to make a comment?
The CFIA. I think everyone in this room knows who I am, Dennis. They saw me on Tuesday. The CFIA might have some interest in this because there were some anecdotal rumors about that international waste being fed to pigs that might be for human consumption.
And, okay,
So
so
CFIA might have some interest in,
the Canadian Food Inspection Agency
yeah.
might, you think?
Well, in so much as the pork products may be being made available then later down the road for human consumption, and that whether or not that material would be safe for ingestion by animals that are then for human consumption.
Okay, all I can say in answer to this question is that my team is in the room that hears this. We'll try to figure out what I can do without being completely ultra-virus. If I can do something with, I will talk to Gary Holman, who's our MLA. I will speak to local mayors and see if there's any, what their current, because I'm not up to speed on what they are currently planning to do about it. I'm very aware of the level of anxiety, and I'll also find out what can be done about waste that may be coming in from other countries.
Could you also please contact Environmentally? I've been trying to make phone calls to VDOT for the health concerns that we have, because there's a lot of us that have a lot of health concerns about this issues. They are really just washing their hands of this,
Yeah.
and it's very concerning.
Okay, so I've got a list of to-do things, right? So I will do these things. And perhaps what we could do, because there's so much concern about this one issue, so that we can keep when this meeting, when we get to the natural end of all the questions, anyone who wants to stay and discuss this with me further, and I'll invite any other elected municipal officials who happen to be in the room, if they're willing to help me out here. I'd like to be able to have a to-do list of things that I can do on your behalf, even if it's not my jurisdiction, right? So I can do that. And if you want to stay later so we can keep discussing it, and ideally I'd love to know from within the group of people here who are working on this issue, if one or two people would be willing to be my points of contact so I have a way to report back to you about what's happening. And then ask you to keep everybody else informed. If that's, so we can talk about that after, if that's okay? Okay, good. All right, thank you very much for raising it, and thanks for that way of handling it. Yes, at the back wall.
Yes, I was wondering if you think the government will ever bring back the energy retrofit program that's sort of been on and off the table. I was part of that share of balance riding. It's a fantastic program. It's basically revenue neutral, okay, and it's a win-win situation. It brings in tax dollars, it brings in government GST. I mean, no homer gets $5,000 back. Okay, I got maybe $2,500 for my house from a 52 to a 76. Okay, you save a whack of money 3 years down the road.
And it makes a house, it reduces the carrying costs for a house long term. It makes it more affordable. It increases its property value. It reduces greenhouse gases. It's all,
Yes,
it creates employment. It's a great program. Stephen Harper hates it. I mean, we've tried really hard to bring it back. When you consider that we were the only jurisdiction in the G20 that in the face of the 2008 financial crisis, remember everybody brought in a stimulus package. Every other country in the G20, and I mean every, China particularly, India, Brazil, Germany, all the Europeans obviously, made a big part of their economic stimulus package investments in energy efficiency and investments in renewable energy. And our economic stimulus package, who remembers what it was you could get as a homeowner for a tax rebate for changes in your home? Remember? Kitchens, kitchen retrofits and new decks. Stephen Harper is not afraid to address the terrible crisis of ugly kitchens. But he is not willing to address the climate crisis. So I mean, I'm a bit facetious about this. I couldn't believe it when I saw that when we had an economic stimulus package, we didn't bring back a proven program it's widely supported by Canadians, that, as you say, delivers benefits, right? So we will eventually get that program back, I'm sure, but not till after 2015. And I'm not saying that in a partisan way. I'd love to be wrong. I'd love to see the ministers around the cabinet table say, I'm hearing from my constituents and everybody misses that program. But we got it extended by a year from a lot of effort. And I thought once it was extended for a year, it would stay on for good. But they killed it. I think it was budget 2011 they killed it. Yes.
They've killed it a couple of times because I was under the Liberal, when the Liberals were in power.
Yeah.
That's when I was in the program, and then I told Ministry of Natural Resources, I said, do you think that this government's going to keep, when they had their first minority, I said, do you think they'll keep the program? She said, they'll be crazy to get rid of it. Sure enough, on the back page of the Ottawa Citizen on a Saturday, I saw it. They always announce everything Friday at 5 o'clock, right?
Yeah.
That they cancel. So I saw that the program was canceled. Instead of having 3 years to do it, I had 6 months.
Yeah.
Once I lost everything.
Well, it's a great program, and I think we can keep working to bring it back. It's one of those things like the first question from Carolyn about what are the clean tech opportunities? What are the things we could be doing that diversify our economy and create good jobs? I saw a hand up from the gentleman here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jen Swanston.
Yeah.
I'm particularly concerned about the issues that relate to democracy, how the country's run. The treatment of the First Nations people. I'm particularly aware of what happens in South America and many countries. Mr. Harper just took a big fat trip down to Peru and all of these things, like when we become concerned, it seems to me we're reacting to. And this is not my agenda. I would like to say, this is what I do. And the idea of being a citizen in this country and having a say in where we go and what we do seems to be under really heavy attack. So I've been spending the last year or two putting some attention on this, and I thought we have a very clear difference in government between administration and ethics or politics or whatever you want to call it, the sense of what we are as a country, what are our values, this is a character. And I think that we need to start claiming for ourselves, not the reaction to us, oh I don't like that, but we need to start talking to each other and saying, this is what I'd like to see happen. I would like to go forward with this, and in particular, when you think about it, and this is not just Canada, this is, I've traveled a fair bit to last year. It's all over the world. People are absolutely fed up with politicians. They're absolutely fed up. And it's almost like this cancer. Like if I look at Harper's effect on the country, I'm appalled. And so...
And ashamed.
Ashamed, yeah, disgusted. Disappointed, all those kinds of words. And yet, we keep on reacting to what he does. How about us getting together as citizens, little by little? There's one last thing. There's one item that doesn't fall in this class, and maybe it does, but does need reaction and does speak up. I don't know if you'd like to come up.
Jim, first of all, thank you. The concerns about democracy, I think, are increasingly widespread across Canada. I think there's some very encouraging signs, and in terms of Parliament, I think one of the most encouraging things that happened, I didn't mention that from this spring session, was the bravery of a Conservative member of Parliament from Edmonton, Brent Rathgaber, in leaving his caucus to sit as an independent. I gave him my last question, the last week of June. I get a question a week in question period. So I gave him my question, because I thought, a need for his colleagues who've been so bullied by the people in PMO. I want them to be able to see that Brent, now walking across the floor and sitting all by himself as an independent, has a voice right away. Didn't want him to have to wait to ask his first question in question period. He's a real gentleman. He said, I'm only willing to accept this from you on the condition you'll accept when I return the favor, and in the fall, I'll give you one of my questions. I said, that's fine. But the reason he left his caucus, and I don't know how many of you heard about Brent leaving and what he said when he left? He just brilliant stuff. He said, look, he was an early reformer. He said, we were so disgusted by the behavior of the Liberals, and now everything our government is doing is worse. We're seeing, you know, an abuse and a culture of entitlement and disregard for what the individual MP does or says at a level that is extreme. And he's staying right on top of it. I'm speaking, part of my democracy tour starts with the panel in Halifax includes Brent Rathgaber. So I think that and a lot of people are resonating to this reality that this doesn't feel right. One of the things, by the way, that doesn't feel right that this government does, it's not this government, it's this administration. I try to keep my language clear. Stephen Harper wants to be branded as the Harper government.
Yes.
I'm a member of the government. As your member of Parliament, the Parliament is government. I'm not a member of the governing party. I'm obviously not a member of the Conservatives, who now have the majority of seats. But under our principles of democracy, I am, as a member of Parliament, the representative of the government of Canada when I stand here before you. And one thing that they've done that no previous government has done, and I don't know how many of you noticed that recently John Duncan made an announcement at Panorama Rec, and on the extension of the Gulf Islands National Park, Michelle Rempel came in from Calgary. And on when they opened the Salt Spring Island Library, they sent in a nice guy, Andrew Saxton from Vancouver. That only Mr. Harper has ever believed that the money is his, that every decision of government has to be branded Harper Conservative, and that as a member of Parliament, I'm not notified when there are federal announcements in this riding. They go way out of their way to make sure I won't find out that there's announcements happening in the ridings for which they've sent in John Duncan or sent in Michelle Rempel. The convention before Mr. Harper was this: as a courtesy, whenever a member of Parliament goes into the riding of another member of Parliament, you're supposed to let them know in advance, just as a courtesy. I still do this, but now, so understanding the principle of Westminster parliamentary democracy and understanding I'm part of government. I'm a member of Parliament, I'm an opposition member of Parliament, but Mr. Harper reports to Parliament. Parliament is supreme in our Constitution, and he is distorting this so badly. That's what I worry about, is how do we repair it? If we don't make it a not Harper bashing, but a non-partisan issue, so Canadians understand how badly our system is being savaged, we won't be able to repair it later. Yes, ma'am.
I'd just like to make a comment, and I'd like to thank you because I think you're a very efficient voice for But I would also like to say that in the years that I've been a Canadian, I was considerably more embarrassed when Mr. Chrétien was the Prime Minister here. In fact, for the years that he was, I travelled with my British passport. I'm not a Canadian. I think we have two solutions for Canada. One is what Preston Manning once tried to do, and that was to remove all the gilt-edged privileges for MPs, which make them unwilling to take a stand against any leader of the party, because they like their perks and their life is much too comfortable. I also would suggest to you that a lot of Canadians are extremely apathetic, and I am a Canadian. And I would suggest that if everyone who turns up to your constituency meetings were to go back and individually write letters and keep writing them, rather than depending on you going back to Parliament and say, I have spoken to 10,000 people and they're all on the same page that I am. So if we could get over our apathy and start voicing directly to Parliament, I think then we'll see a change, but only then, not even in spite of your break. So
well, thank you for your kind opening. Thank you, because I feel privileged. I am very privileged to work for you, and I am trying to demonstrate the way things should be. Now, I know, goodness knows, I know. I mean, I'm not perfect, but I do put all my expenses online where everybody can see them. And I think that's already had an effect, because now the Liberals say they're going to start doing it. I actually don't think that the problem is that MPs don't want to give up their privileges. They're more afraid of pain and punishment than they are of losing privileges. That said, another thing I do is I only fly economy, and I pass all my friends from Parliament sitting in first class as I make my way back to economy. And I had a funny conversation once with a friend who was a previous Reform Party member, now Conservative, and I was in the bulkhead seats, which you might know, or so before takeoff, when the curtains are back, the plebes can actually reach forward into first class. And I just had pulled out my thing to watch the movies and the earphones, and my earphone set was broken. And right ahead of me, I won't say what GMP it was because that wouldn't be fair, I saw that they had a brand new set sitting there, and if I waited for the flight attendant, it was going to cost $3. So I just said, do you need yours? My arm went forward, you see. I said, excuse me, do you need yours? And they turned and said, wasn't there room for you up here today? I said, well, you know, I always fly back here. And they said, oh, Preston used to do that. when it was Preston, we all flew in economy. And then I said, but you know, over time we discovered it's much more efficient to fly in business class because we arrive rested. So we work more efficiently. And it's really a better idea. And what was going through my head was George Orwell and Animal Farm. When the pigs discovered it really was a good idea to sleep in beds. Anyway, but I don't think it's the privileges that keep them silent and not challenging their leaders. I've got a private member's bill to remove the requirement that leaders sign the nomination papers for candidates. That's a big mistake that happened in the 1960s. They didn't think it through at Elections Canada. It's the first time, some of you are old enough to remember, when you went to vote, it was the name of the candidate and the party wasn't mentioned. When they added the name of the party next to the name of the candidate, they just decided, how do we know for sure this person represents the Liberals or Progressive Conservatives, whatever. So the leader had to sign the nomination papers. If we can get rid of that and say a local riding association can affirm that that candidate is their candidate, that's good enough. We have to also change the system. Canada is the only, I think we're the only one, certainly the only one I can think of Westminster parliamentary democracies in the British Commonwealth set of nations. We have the system of government that we share in the British Commonwealth. It's only in Canada that a caucus can't remove the leader. So I think that Margaret Thatcher was removed by John Major. And in Australia recently we've seen Kevin Rudd removed by Julia Gillard, and then Julia Gillard removing Kevin Rudd. A caucus can remove a leader. Only in Canada does the Prime Minister, as leader of the party, have an absolute secure spot. It can only be removed by the party membership in convention. So there are a lot of ways in which MPs are scared to buck the system because they will be punished. Whether they're NDPers or Liberals or Conservatives, they will be punished. And the object lesson for a Conservative about don't rock the boat, don't make Stephen Harper, what's the worst thing he can do to an MP? Think about what happened to Helena Gerges. She didn't, as far as I know, she broke no law. He said, we're calling the RCMP on her, we're calling the Ethics Commissioner on her, I'm throwing her out of cabinet, I'm throwing her out of caucus. And when she went to court, the court said, which is a terrible precedent, this is Stephen Harper, in saying those things about her, was exercising royal prerogative, and the court will not intervene. So you libel and slander or whatever, the courts will not intervene if a prime minister fires a cabinet member or says something about an MP. So that's pretty scary for someone. You can lose your job, you can certainly lose your perks, you can lose your reputation, and you have no recourse. So, and they're also looking for court damages. She has to pay court damages to the Conservative Party for suing on libel and slander.
And he calls himself a Christian.
I don't know that he ever has.
Oh, yes.
No, I've never heard him call himself a Christian.
Look it up.
Other people think he is.
It's there.
No, I'm serious. He's been asked point blank if he is a Christian, and he has said he prefers not to answer the question. A lot of left-wing journalists have said that he is an evangelical Christian and belongs to a certain church. And I mean, he may in fact, but I've seen no evidence of it. That's all.
Well, the only reason I say that is because that's why he doesn't believe in all this climate change, because the Lord would never allow
No, I don't
that
think
to
so.
happen.
I don't think so. No, I'm sorry. Well, I mean, you may be right, but I'm saying I've observed Stephen Harper closely since he became leader of the Alliance Party. I've known him a long time. And I'm a churchgoer, I'm regular about it, and one might say I go to church religiously. Sorry. I run into Lorraine Harper when I'm leaving church in Ottawa, and she's out jogging, and we joke about the fact that she's never going to get caught in church, right? So, like, they're not, they're kind of, I don't see it, but the left wing, not that all the media is left wing, I'm not saying the media is left wing, media, some is left, some is right, whatever. But there's a tendency to think that because Stephen Harper appears to have all the same worldview as George Bush, that he's motivated by the same set of faith-based values around, you know, rapture and the end of the world. I personally don't see it. I know him pretty well. I think he doesn't believe in climate change because it's inconvenient, because all he wants to do is expand production of fossil fuels. So he chooses not to believe. He's never had a science briefing. But I don't think that his objections are the ones that came out of Marcy McDonald's book about the Armageddon factor. I think she's right about a lot of what she wrote, but her starting premise was, this is the church he belongs to. This is what that church believes. I'm just sharing with you that I don't see any evidence. I don't know what he believes in or worships. He's never said himself. So I'll just take him at his word. He hasn't ever said that he follows any particular religion. Yes?
I would like to thank you, and I would like to thank Adam, and I would like to thank all of the politicians who have run in Saanich, the islands, and have done so treating each other with dignity and respect, and treating their constituencies with dignity and respect. And if anybody wants to know what will help democracy, young people responded in droves because there was someone they could vote for instead of something they had to cynically vote against. And I would like also to mention that you are in a very, to me, an important line. I'm 71, but I am old enough to remember Major General George Randolph Kirk's Victoria Cross, who was one of our neighbors, who was our MP. We would have voted for him if he had run for the Purple Onion Party. He was such an incredibly fantastic human being, and he lived, love your neighbor.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're doing too, and that's what our councillors and our local MLA are trying to do. And I am just so thankful to see that, because that's what gives us hope and encouragement for the future, that democracy really does matter, and that if you put your feet into it and your teeth into it, keep doing it.
Thank you. But I'm just going to say, I don't know how the other politicians get through the day when they're told to be nasty to each other. I will tell you that sometimes I've had people say things that are mean in the House of Commons and come over afterwards and say, I'm really sorry. I had to read that out, but you know, I really, you know, and I'll give them a hug and say, I don't blame you, it's okay. Because it's not worth living to go through being rotten people. And most of the people I work with in the House of Commons are such nice people. You'd really like them, all of them. Well, maybe there's one or two that are hard to like, but it's not because of partisanship. It's just not everybody's as lovely as everybody else. But it makes life a lot better for me that I'm enjoying the people with whom I work, and I treat everybody with respect, because that's how I want to be treated in return. And I think if we could get Parliament to behave properly, we'd get people respecting Parliament, we'd get more people voting, and that's also part of the core goal here, which reminds me, I should say, we need to get rid of first past the post system. But I've got 3 hands left. So you're next, and then there. Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Because it will be stopping all and killing all the wildlife and the beautiful parks around everywhere. That is my tip.
The question that was just asked, and in the back, I'm sure you couldn't hear, was what are we doing to stop the pipeline proposal across northern British Columbia, and can we stop it? And that reminds me too, Jim, I never answered your question about the Canada and China investment treaty, so I'll get back to that. We're doing everything possible to stop the proposed Enbridge Northern Gateway project, and it's shocking to me that there's still any chance of it being approved, given that the British Columbia government has said that on the evidence presented by the company that wants to build the project, Enbridge, they didn't produce evidence that they knew what they were doing. That's the bottom line of what the province said. They haven't produced evidence that they know what to do if there's a spill of this bitumen mixed with diluent. They haven't shown that they know, their evidence doesn't even really talk about bitumen and diluent. They acted as if it's the same stuff as crude oil. If it spills on a pipeline across northern BC, if it spills from a tanker from Kitimat coming out, heading south or further west, they don't know how it behaves in the environment. Yesterday I mentioned Adam Olson and I and Andrew Weaver did a press conference. We received a lot of documentation that came from somebody in government who took a huge chance to send it to us, proving that we spent $78 million this year on research and preparation for helping Enbridge on the assumption the tankers were going to be approved. That's how all the documents read. Now, they're available on the Green Party website. You can have a look at them yourself. We didn't put all of them up there. We put the key ones up. And a fascinating response, I don't know how many of you saw this in this morning's paper, from Joe Oliver, Minister of Natural Resources, was to make fun of us and say, oh, well, they just missed the fact this was already announced. Well, I can assure you I didn't miss the fact it was already announced because it was never announced. I went back just for the heck of it and read everything he'd submitted on their website of Natural Resources Canada and the press conference. It's true that in the course of a tanker announcement in Vancouver in March, he mentioned that the federal government was going to do some research into non-conventional fossil fuels such as bitumen. But there was nothing that said we're going to focus our research aims and spend $78 million this year in ways that are clearly directed to one project which is currently under review. And meanwhile, we're slashing, we shut down the marine contaminants program. It was 80 scientists across Canada. We've lost all the habitat fisheries officers in DFO because they've removed the habitat protection sections of the Fisheries Act. Lost the experimental lakes area. It looks like the government of Ontario is going to keep it open. The Polar Environmental Arctic Research Lab at Eureka, all the science that used to be funded through the government of Canada on climate change and ozone depletion, all of this is being slashed, and instead we're spent $78 million helping Enbridge. I think it's shocking, and I almost think it's just as shocking that so much of the media was prepared to say it was all announced before. It's not as if we're referring to evidence that's unobtainable. Joe Oliver's press conference and his press release is still online. You can look it up, Natural Resources Canada website from March 2013. The documents that were leaked to us are on our website. You can look at both and see if any sensible person would think that what we were sent and put up online yesterday was revealed in Joe Clark, I love Joe Clark, I'm sorry Joe Oliver's press conference. Not at all. Adam, did you want to add something?
And that program they started funding that program or developing that program in
May 2012.
May 2012. So in fact, they were spending the money, in essence, a year before.
Yeah.
And that program was called the Northern Gateway Project. So it's pretty hard to dispute the fact that this was basically a blank check to do work for an applicant, which he couldn't do in local government. You know, your local government can't pay for an applicant's efforts.
You can't look at a hearing and say, uh-oh, they forgot to do the research on this key bit that was, Enbridge was mandated to provide this evidence to the Joint Review Panel. They didn't do it, so now we're paying for it. If they were funding science up the yin-yang, if every single scientist in the government of Canada was getting the research budget they need to understand freshwater ecology and we have a huge problem happening across Canada right now. It isn't affecting this riding, but Lake Winnipeg and the Great Lakes, and right across Canada, we have a real huge boom of eutrophication and lakes that may go toxic and die. We need a lot of research dollars there. What made the big threat that requires research dollars being spent how you deal with an oil spill with bitumen and diluent from a project that isn't yet approved. What made that the #1 priority? Well, clearly because they want to go ahead and they know Enbridge hasn't done the homework. So, yes, there was a hand on the side of, yes.
Well, it's, I'm another Elizabeth. Actually, you just touched on the issue I wanted to raise. And
Would it be the Center for the Universe?
And that has to do with it.
Okay.
And that is the matter of education in science, because until we can actually really understand what the issues are involved and make considered judgments, our own talk about them is going to be somewhat biased. There is, I think, good evidence for there being some agenda to close down centres that present public research to the public, which is critical. It's a method of bringing kids in. Children love going to the Centre of the Universe. That's our prime, awful example. That closed last weekend. What can be done about this kind of behaviour?
Yeah. I say, and I'm privileged to know this particular Elizabeth Griffith, who is a PhD astrophysicist, scientist, brilliant person, who works in that observatory. So I hope I haven't outed you in a way you didn't want. But she knows her science. The Center for the Universe was costing the National Research Council $250,000 a year. And we're supposed to accept that they have to spend $78 million this year on Enbridge and don't have $250,000 a year to keep open a center that informs children and adults on the nature of the universe. I mean, I've never felt so dumb in my life as standing next to that, Elizabeth, while she explained what she could see through the telescope of what gases were forming and what it told us about when stars were being made and how long ago it was that was actually happening that we were watching. I tried to keep up with you and pretend I understood. It was brilliant stuff. And if we got more kids in, and right after Chris Hadfield doing his tour and making kids interested in science, we're closing the Center for the Universe. Some good news is I think there are some discrete efforts being made by some good people to try to find ways to keep it open and transfer its functions, but I can't say too much about it because it's all quite preliminary. What we have in this government, in this administration of Stephen Harper, is an anti-science agenda. And it's also not just science, it's an anti-evidence agenda. So that's why they got rid of the long-form census. That's why they're getting rid of Centers for Aboriginal Health that report on statistics on Aboriginal health. All kinds of public policy formation policy groups, National Roundtable on Environment Economy, places where you assemble enough evidence to inform a policymaker are being shut down, not randomly, but systematically. And our opportunities to understand science are being reduced. So, you know, I think a lot of this can be repaired by a future government, but I think it's important to talk about it. I think it's important. You mentioned our friend Canadian from the UK, and I never got your name. Sorry, but you're right. We need to write letters. If we could, the place to write letters, the most useful thing is to write letters to the editors of newspapers. The Globe and Mail, because they don't get the British Columbia point of view very often. The National Post, as well as the Vancouver Sun, the Times Colonist. But reaching out to Eastern Canada, well, that actually coming from Nova Scotia, Toronto isn't Eastern Canada, but reaching out to the papers that describe themselves as national, but really aren't. But it'd be good to get as many points of view in there about democracy, about the cuts to science, about why we won't take this line down anymore, about the fact that our young people deserve to have a center for the universe, to understand what's going on. And by the way, just to mention, I've recruited, you know, Bob McDonald from Quirks and Quarks. They said he'll do something to help us on the Center for the Universe. And I know that Lana Popham has got a petition going. It's slightly outside my writing, but it is in hers. So there are efforts not to take this line down. Just because something's slated to be closed, we don't have to accept it. I'm really happy, of course, that the Plant Health Center, I got them to reverse that. I did, but there was people helping me. It's really important not to take these, you know, these announcements that it's closing and that's it and you can't save it. The Experimental Lakes area, there's one woman who made the difference who's keeping the Experimental Lakes area open. And her name is Diane Orahel. She's a PhD, she's a grad student working on her PhD at Experimental Lakes area. She was doing research on what happens with nanoparticles. And she decided to put her PhD on hold and fight for the Experimental Lakes area. One young woman. She put her PhD on hold, and she was the whole driving force that never gave up, that got other groups together, that got full-page ads in the Globe and Mail, that made it, I mean, have you all heard of the Experimental Lakes area as a fight that's going on? A lot of people never heard about Pearl. There was nobody at the Polar Environmental Arctic Research Lab who fought for it the way Diane Orahel fought for the Experimental Lakes area. And now we've got the Government of Ontario and the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and I think they're going to get some money out of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to keep the Experimental Lakes area going, because there's no center like it anywhere on the planet. 58 separate lakes that have been monitored for all their variables since the 1960s, so that you can do whole lake research. It's extraordinary. And it's sometimes I think, oh yeah, I'm going on a rant here, I'm sorry. But I feel sometimes as though what's happening to science in this country is not that different than vandals breaking into the great libraries of old and setting fire to all the books.
Yeah.
This is serious stuff that's happening, and we should be angry about it, but we should also be positive and loving and willing to find ways to fix all this. But we've got to raise our voices about it. We can't just assume it's all happening and we can't stop it. So that was a bit of a rant. You were next, yes.
Okay, thanks a lot for what you're doing with regard to refugees and other persons from Syria. My name is Joyce Thompson. I have family that have worked with an Islamic woman as their assistant when they spent 4 years in Aleppo, Syria. And they're trying to get her and her family out, 3 children from 5 to 1 year of age. And the government, the immigration department, will not let them come with all expenses paid by a number of us, living in a home in Kelowna with the couple that worked with them. And she's applied twice, had to go to Beirut, which ordinarily from Aleppo takes 5 hours. It took her each time 18 hours both ways, with guns being shot off and vehicles wrecked, to try to get her visitor's visa. And the first time the place said, the consulate said it was a perfect form for a visitor's visa, and she should hear within 2 weeks. She did hear within 2 weeks that she was turned down. This was in February.
Has she gone to her MP?
Yeah, they've gone to Dan Elvin, the Conservative in Kelowna, and all he said on the second time of sending her to Beirut, which they already had all the information, and they had it in Ottawa. They forced her to go to Beirut a second time to appear. He said, well, you've got to get important people signing letters for you. Well, most of the so-called important people have left, or if there's still the odd one there, they won't sign their name to anything anymore, and rightly so. Also, 2 weeks ago, her family doctor went to Beirut, and on his way back was shot and killed. And it's just an absolute nightmare. She's living in a 3rd floor apartment building, and every time my relative talks to her on Skype, you can hear the guns going off all the time.
Yeah.
And I know.
I'm just thinking, Janet, can we do it even? We'll do it. We have, okay,
And they're saying they'll only accept 1,400 refugees by the end of 2014.
No, I mean, it's a terrible situation. It was a nightmare, but there's so many people I've wanted to help get out of Syria. I've succeeded with 2 husbands of Syrian wives, and getting them out took our office. I mean, it's just really hard. It's hard, but I know the ways to make enough noise to try. I mean, I can't promise, but even the thing that we've, just to give you some statistics, for people who don't know about this, there are now 2 million refugees from Syria in camps in Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. There is insufficient funding in the UN High Commission on Refugees to help the people in those camps. So sometimes women get to those camps and then they're raped and they're terrified and they're in the camps, but they can't ever feel safe. They also can't always get in the camps. Quite recently, we had Syrians with connections to Canada who were trying to get help at the Canadian Embassy in Ankara, couldn't get past the guards. They went to the refugee camp, wouldn't get accepted in the refugee camp. I was trying to, I won't go through all the things I was trying to do, but they ended up going back to Syria before I could help them. But where the people you're talking about have a sponsor in Canada, have tried and tried, maybe I can do something if you could get me all the paperwork on that. But the situation, there's 2 million refugees. 100,000 people have already been killed inside Syria. And between the, one of the more interesting things that I learned about the humanitarian crisis was from these young men that we, thank God, got back to their lives in Canada. They never lived in Canada, but they were Syrian young men who were married to Syrian Canadian women. And one of the things about the terror of that journey from Aleppo to Beirut to ask about their visitor's permit was, for young men, you think, okay, less danger for them than for young women. But no, actually, they're terrified of being grabbed by either the rebel forces or Assad's forces and forced into fighting. The young men that I met anyway, regarded the choice of Assad or the rebels as kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. They weren't political, they couldn't see a benefit for them in either one of these warring factions. The rebel forces in Syria are now substantially contaminated by foreign fighters from Al-Qaeda who've come in. Bashar al-Assad is not somebody anyone's going to defend. So you end up with these very vulnerable civilian population. That's all I care about in this situation, is this vulnerable civilian population, the crisis for refugees. I met with the UN High Commission on Refugees to try to get help for a number of people I knew, and they said, look, we've got several refugee crises all at once. We've got Mali. We didn't expect Mali to go. Well, why was Mali suddenly a refugee crisis? It's because we messed up in Libya. We bombed Libya. We said we were in there for responsibility to protect the civilians. And when the moment came that we could actually have a peace plan and a ceasefire to actually protect civilians, suddenly Canada's goals shifted along with our allies, and we said, no, we won't take a ceasefire unless Gaddafi leaves. So suddenly it's about regime change. There was nobody on the ground to notice, which was well reported, that there were Al-Qaeda forces in the forefront of the anti-Gaddafi forces. So when Gaddafi was killed and the rebels took hold, there were warehouses full of ground-to-air missiles and weapons of all kinds that went empty straight into the hands of Al-Qaeda, most likely. And one of the places they went was to Mali, creating the insurgency and the devastation there. If we'd been smart about Libya, we would have done anything to get a ceasefire, get UN peacekeepers on the ground, and have them guarding warehouses full of weapons to make sure they don't go to Al-Qaeda. We have the same scenario happening right now. Whatever chemical weapons Assad has, and there's no question he has them, I don't want Al-Qaeda having them either. So if we could focus on humanitarian relief and getting a ceasefire, that's what we should be doing. And so I used your question about refugees and segued into what we should do on Syria. It's a mess right now because thanks to the fact of using responsibility to protect as a pretense to go into Libya and letting the mission morph into regime change, we no longer have the ability of getting a responsibility to protect mission supported by the UN Security Council because Russia and China say, why would we trust you? This is about responsibility to protect. Last time you used it for regime change, so we've been precluded from using a doctrine that I think was important, that the world community has a responsibility to protect innocent civilians. Through our actions as allies in Libya, we wrecked the chance to use responsibility to protect 2 years ago to start protecting civilians in Syria. trying to protect them now, something is better than nothing. And in the meantime, any one individual family that we can help rescue, I want to try. But it's clearly less than a drop in the bucket with the scale of human suffering that's going on in this area right now. So let's talk later and get the information and see if I can shake anything loose from calling cabinet ministers who aren't in the House right now. Any other questions? I promised we'd be 7 to 9. We've still got 15 minutes left. So I should, and after 9 we'll have our meeting on the compost. So I'm just checking. Yes, your hand was up before, and then you, sir. Okay. And then if everybody else has asked a question, I could go back to you after. Okay? Yeah.
Mark Hedger, sorry. You wouldn't be representing Saanich and the islands. You couldn't not have to field a question about marijuana and the omnibus crime bill. What do you have to say about that? What bothers me is that the law of the land is one thing and seems to be going to more extreme as far as incarceration and all this. Meanwhile, the police forces here say, we can't handle all these people, we can't put them all in jail. What's the answer here? It's not right for part of the country not to agree what's going on with the government, but the government has to be responsible. What do you say about this crime bill?
Thank you. And Jim, I remembered again, I haven't answered your question about the Canada-China Investment Treaty, then I'll answer the marijuana question. The Canada-China Investment Treaty is currently not ratified, which is good news. I've been working very hard on getting conservatives to help us stop it from being ratified, because it can be ratified any time by cabinet acting alone. Stephen Harper could have it ratified any day, and then it locks us in for 31 years. In the meantime, we don't know if the Hupakasset First Nation is going to appeal. They're very brave. They took it to court. The federal government is asking for federal government court costs against this little First Nation. So if you're willing to look at the website for Lead Now and send a donation to help the First Nation, that would be great, because even if they don't appeal, they still have legal costs to handle. Now, on the cannabis question, certainly every politician in Canada is being asked if they ever smoked dope, and I'm the only one who actually grew up in the 60s and never did. I was very square as a kid, and my brother can tell you about it. But anyway, but we do support, because it only makes sense, legalization, regulation, and taxation, because the policies of criminalization are failed policies. And as you said, in the omnibus, the overhaul of the criminal code, we've now made it a mandatory minimum for possession of more than 4, or is it 6 individual marijuana plants. You have a mandatory minimum jail time if they decide it was with intent to traffic. Right? So our laws are getting tougher and sort of throwing the book at people who have cannabis plants, when states in the United States are saying we're not going to have a criminal policy around cannabis. The police chiefs of Canada are saying, look, please don't make us prosecute and put people in jail for cannabis possession. Let us just write them a ticket or something, because it's a waste of law enforcement resources to be chasing after people who are smoking marijuana. Interestingly enough, apparently the proportion of Canadians who smoke marijuana is higher than the proportion of people in the Netherlands who do, where it's legal. So the laws are right up against societal norms. And they also don't make sense. There's no, again, evidence-based decision-making. There's no evidence. Certainly there isn't evidence that marijuana is good for you if you're healthy. There's very good evidence that marijuana can be very helpful for pain relief, and for certain illnesses, marijuana is very helpful. There's no evidence that marijuana is good for you. But there's equally no evidence that it's any more dangerous than alcohol or cigarettes. So why have it be a prescribed drug, and why have we got these tough on crime policies? One thing that my office has been digging into a lot, and we've done quite a lot of access to information requests at tracking the interest that Stephen Harper has in privatizing prisons. So there is some of that going on as well. But we don't need to be building more prisons, and we don't need to be putting people in jail for cannabis. We definitely need a lot more mental health facilities. We need a lot more things that are geared to keep young people healthy, and positive in their thinking. That's one of the hardest things, is how many young people quickly become, I think there's an epidemic of depression. I mean, I'm the mom of a 22-year-old, but when she was going through high school, certainly an experience I never had, of constant worry about more than one, a certain number of friends who were suicidal. And I kept worrying that one of her friends was going to commit suicide and she was going to feel it was all her fault. She felt it was her job to try to keep these kids okay. And I mean, it's an epidemic of mental health issues among adolescents. It's clear to me as a mother that this isn't what I grew up with. So what's happening to these kids? Why do they feel so disempowered? Why do they feel so alienated? We certainly know that internet bullying, that's something I never had to face. I mean, kids who weren't nice to me at school, I could leave them at school and go home. They weren't following me home on a computer that I used for social. I mean, this whole current situation is quite, you know, I think it's a real crisis. I think a lot of other politicians do as well, but we're not handling it very well. We need a lot more mental health investment. We need a lot more things for young people, and we need to let them know they're really important to us. And we're not just going to let them drown on their own. We've got to help them. Marijuana isn't something that I want to see a lot of young people using, but I sure don't want to see us continue down the path of treating marijuana users as criminals and wasting police resources, tracking them down and putting them in jail. So that was a bit of a rant. Sorry about that. Now there was another. Yes, you have the next question.
My name is Tim Dunford, Ms. May. You've spoken a bit about the problems in the House. I'd appreciate your perspective on the appropriate role and future of the Senate.
The Senate. I wondered when the Senate was going to come up. I heard a good one the other day. What does Mike Duffy and Anna Green Gables have in common? They both have fictional homes on Prince Edward Island. That's a good one. I used to be a defender of the Senate because I saw the Senate when it worked well for sober second thought. So my personal views were somewhat at odds with many people in my party because I thought, I'll give you one quick example. It was the Senate of Canada. When I got a tip-off that they were about to register bovine growth hormone, I talked to Vera Spivak, who was a senator who was upset about bovine growth hormone. She talked to Eugene Whalen. They convened hearings and they subpoenaed the scientists who were worried that bovine growth hormone would be damaging to the health of the dairy industry, to cows and people. And we kept it from being registered. We'd have bovine growth hormone in Canada today for sure if it wasn't for the Canadian Senate. The reason I now believe we have to abolish the Senate is what Stephen Harper has done to it. He's appointed people at a much younger age. They'll be there for a long, long time. He's appointed people who have not achieved the kind of lifetime civic duty. I mean, there's always been patronage appointments to the Senate, but overall, over time, there have been some fine people in the Senate who have a good head on their shoulders and understand public policy and don't vote down the bills that come from the House because they know perfectly well they lack the legitimacy to do that because they're not elected. But actually sometimes work on bills, rarely send them back to the House amended, hold hearings, cast light on things. What's happened, the kinds of people that Stephen Harper has appointed, and I don't even particularly need Pamela Wallin or Mike Duffy, although those are, Mike Duffy's a particularly egregious example. Patrick Brazo, young, in his 30s or early 40s, people who have no credentials at all except for being Conservative Party workers. That's all the credentials they have. And the willingness of those people as Conservative senators to defeat a bill from the House. And it happened once, and it was very rare that we got a good bill through in the minority government period. Bruce Heyer's bill on climate change accountability passed the House of Commons, went to the Senate, and before it could go to committee, this is the first time in the history of Canada this scenario had ever happened, the Conservative senators voted down a bill passed by the House of Commons before it could go to committee on the climate bill. So my concern now is the only way to fix the Senate is to either find a way, which is very difficult because the Governor General appoints senators and removing them is it's almost impossible. If you couldn't, you'd have to sort of fire all the senators and start from scratch. Otherwise, my concern is that Stephen Harper may continue to order them to defeat bills after he's no longer Prime Minister, if he's still a leader of the Conservative Party. which I think he'll have to resign soon, I remain optimistic about that. But I've come to the point that I think Canada should replicate exactly what New Zealand has done with its system of government. New Zealand has proportional representation, mixed member proportional voting for the House of Commons, and New Zealand abolished its upper house. But abolishing the Senate is going to be really hard because you have to open the Constitution to do it, and the provinces oppose it. So I would rather fight to actually abolish the Senate so that we have a clean slate than I think an elected Senate could be a bad idea. Now, I will admit that the Green Party official policy is an elected Senate, so I am differing from my party policy. But just because I'd really like to know how all of you feel about it, how many people here think the Senate should be abolished? And how many people would prefer to see us keep the Senate but have it elected? And how many people think that we should keep the Senate but find some other route to reform it? Okay. So abolition wins. There we go. But that doesn't mean, I'm just getting a sense of things. It's a mess because under the Constitution, the House of Commons can't vote. The House of Commons, by the way, could change first past the post to mixed member proportional with a vote of the House. It doesn't require opening the Constitution. There are many things we can do to fix the system that don't require opening the Constitution. But fixing the Senate will require opening up the Constitution. And just checking, before I go to someone who's made a point already, but his first point was excellent, he didn't actually ask the question. Is there anyone else who needs to ask a question before I go back to, was it Dale?
Lloyd.
Lloyd! Sorry, Lloyd. Okay, nobody minds if Lloyd goes next? Okay, good. Go ahead, Lloyd.
Well, I forgot to ask my question.
Yeah, because your preamble was so damn good.
Okay. Would you support reverting our tax law to what it was before the year 2000, and instead of spending those surpluses, put it towards paying off the national debt and redeeming and paying money towards the CPP because they own about a third of our debt? And that way, as well as paying off the debt, we could give the CPP money to invest in renewable energy and rail transport and other pro-anti-climate change investment.
Because I actually do develop budgets and put them forward as part of campaign planning and documentation, I can't just, as attractive as it is to say, yes, I'd take exactly the same tax system and do exactly that with it. I will say that in broad strokes, we favor taking tax, any surpluses, and paying down debt. We favor not having a deficit, but right now we're in a deficit position. So to get to where we could be able to start paying off debt, we've got to remove a deficit that's been created in the last, well, it's been created in the last 5 years. We also need to look at what tax rates. The tax rates before 2000, I mean, I think the corporate tax rates have gone too low, but I'd rather peg the corporate tax rate at 18%, which was what it was in 2006 or 2007, rather than go back to the 25% corporate tax rate that was there in 2000. So there's a lot of different taxes that have been cut and readjusted. It's also, if we go back to 2000, we're going to GST at 7%. That may be something we want to do, but I want to look at the whole tax code and how it operates and figure out if we can find the tax revenue in ways that continue to stimulate the economy. And that may involve more tax shifting than just going back to exactly what we had before 2000.
Well, as a side comment, if we, say the monetary value of the tax cuts from 2000 to 2006 is worth 80 billion as opposed to 100 billion, as it was worth in 2006. We have a $50 billion deficit right now. With the $80 billion in increased revenue, you go from a $50 billion deficit to a $30 billion surplus. So you could partially repay the debt.
Yes.
And also, if you immediately balance the books to improve the country's credit rating, that attracts investment. And if international investors can see that there is a concrete, doable way to pay off the debt within less than 2 decades, that gives them incentive to invest while they can, well, before the economy gets so hot that they have to fight to get in.
In general, I think you're right. I just don't want to commit to the same tax code exactly that we had before 2000, because going back on, we need to make sure that when I take a position on something, then certainly the details that relate to a budget, we develop every year what we would do as a party, where we would spend the money, how we would, and our position has been to have an increase in tax revenue. But some of it would come from pollution taxes, for instance, which weren't there before 2000. But can I say that in general, the quantity of tax revenues to government should be put towards reducing, eliminating deficit, then paying off debt, and I agree with you entirely about bringing down our credit rating. One of the main reasons that Greens don't like debt and deficit is that it takes our own control of our economy and reduces the sovereign control of our economy as Canadians in a democracy, and makes the governments look over their shoulder at bond raters in New York for fear they're going to take us from AAA to AA, and that increases the interest payments that we have to pay on debt, reduces our ability to deliver on promises that are made in election campaigns, where you suddenly say, oh, if we do that, we're going to get a bad credit rating. And I think to keep our economic plans domestically so that we can live up to what we want as a country, we need to be liberated from, well, it's very hard to do in a globalized economy, but to the greatest extent possible, we don't want to give leverage to the bond raters on Wall Street to change our credit rating based on us having debt and deficit. So, is that okay, Lloyd, for now?
Yeah, I just have a side comment on marijuana. I think marijuana is much more dangerous than alcohol and tobacco, because George Burns was a heck of a lot more intelligent sounding than Tommy Chong.
Lloyd, we should talk later. You're very, very interesting. What do you do for a living? Just curious. Are you a student?
Yes.
And what are you studying?
Economics.
Just interested. I'm interested. Who's your favorite economist? In whose school do you feel most comfortable?
Well, I would say it would be my father was born in Holland, immigrated to here when he was 30, so I had European politics as a bedtime story. So my two favorite economists would be Ludwig Eisenhower, who was the economic advisor to the first Prime Minister of Germany West Germany after World War II, and also one of the economic advisors to Charles de Gaulle. I can't remember his name, unfortunately.
Thank you. Fascinating. Yes, we look like we're going to questions from people who asked the first question, going back to the second question. But let me just check if there's anyone who hasn't asked the first question yet before we adjourn. Okay, so there's, yes, and then so I've got 3 left, and then we're going to stop. Is that okay? So that means we're going to go first, and then the gentleman there, and then our energy retrofit. Yes.
This is sort of a facetious question, but have you approached the independent and moved Conservative Party to ask if maybe you would like to become green?
Yes. I have not asked Brett Rathgaber if he would like to become green. I am interested in Brett Rathgaber having expressed to media that he thinks they need a federal wild rose party, which could be just as good when you think about it. On the other surface. Yeah.
Great, Ms. May, thank you. My question's of a little more general nature about the Canadian system. I think my biggest disappointment in the last election was the vote turnout. I think that's quite unsettling. And as the electronic world seems to be grasping us, I wonder, are there moves afoot to try and bring us to an electronic election? Perhaps, I see that as a double-edged sword. People might just say, oh, I can use my iPhone to vote. I don't know who I'm voting for, but I'm going to vote. But, that makes me a little nervous too. But I think that, if we can file our taxes online, we should be able to vote online. And I think it would help.
Yeah. I believe that getting rid of first past the post, because then everybody will know their vote counts, is a key thing. Voter turnout last time was 60% across Canada. I think you probably all know this, but I think it's fantastic that Saanich Gulf Islands was 75% voter turnout. So just as this is fascinating, because the same point was made at last night's meeting in Gordon Head. So I'm curious to know, how many of you think it would be a good idea to move to some form of electronic voting in order to increase particularly voter turnout among youth?
less opportunity for fiddling.
Yes, we need, and there are concerns, of course, that there'd be more opportunity for fiddling than having a paper ballot you can count later. But I think it's interesting that it's come up 2 nights in a row, and I'm certainly open to it. It's not something, the one thing the Green Party has put forward, which is an approach to get more young people voting, is to say, let's move the voting age to 16, when young people are still in school and could start the process of voting. Because what we find is, if you don't vote at 18, you don't vote at 25, you don't vote at 30, you don't vote at 35. So you start the habit of voting younger. And since they're allowed to drive cars at that age, and that's much more dangerous than voting. Well, maybe not. And the last point to gentleman back.
I'd like to know how serious your fellow MPs and people in Ottawa are on electoral reform for the next election, because the Commissioner for the Elections Canada says it's going to take 2 years before any implementation. To implement any reforms.
Yeah.
So it seems to be stalling all this stuff with the roll calls in the last election and everything. There's a lot of nasty business that went on. There's a lot of fraud that was going on. And I really want to know if your fellow MPs are really serious about actual
Electoral reform.
Thank you.
Well, there was supposed to be a Democratic reform bill. It was supposed to come forward from the Minister of Democratic Reform, Tim Upall. He actually called me to make sure I knew about it. It was supposed to be the very next day, and then it was pulled. So I'm very interested to know what was in that bill. But it was supposed to deal with the robocall issue. Now the Minister for Democratic Reform has been shuffled, and it's now Pierre Poilievre. It's interesting that this is a cabinet level position, and I actually ran into Pierre Poilievre this summer and said, as Minister for Democratic Reform, what's your department? Because there's no department of Democratic Reform. Turns out he has a group of about 30 people inside the Privy Council office who work on Democratic reform. It's an interesting process. I don't know what the delay is or what the content of the Democratic Reform bill will be, but there certainly will be something called Democratic Reform before the House of Commons, I think, pretty soon, since they almost had something tabled. I wonder what was in it that they pulled it. In terms of electoral reform, such as getting rid of first past the post, the NDP support getting rid of first past the post, the Liberals don't, and the Conservatives don't. And certainly the Bloc Québécois don't, because if they first past the post is the reason that the Bloc can have, in the past, official opposition status with only putting forward MPs running in one province. My goal, and I've been pushing it as hard as I can, and we'll see if I have any success. So far I haven't. Has been to say to, for that matter, all parties, but particularly Liberals and New Democrats, can we cooperate in one election, just once, and figure out a way to elect a House of Commons that represents a combination of Liberal, NDP, and Green representation as a majority group, in exchange for getting rid of first past the post and never having to cooperate again. Sort of, you know, because they're not by nature very cooperative. And I haven't, it's interesting because I get a greater sense from Justin Trudeau that he's willing to cooperate, but he doesn't support proportional representation. Whereas Thomas Mulcair says he supports proportional representation, but doesn't want to cooperate. So I'll just have to keep trying, because I think it's really too important not to try. And there's a lot of grassroots cooperation movements going on. I'm speaking at a conference in Orillia, Ontario, towards, is it September 19th? 27th. Thank you, Jamie. Jamie needs my schedule. She knows everything. So, and it's being organized by locals in Orillia. So Joyce Murray, who was the Liberal candidate who favored doing this kind of thing, she's going to Skype into the conference. And a wonderful young NDP member of Parliament named Alexandrine Latendresse is going to actually come. And I'm going to be, so there's lots of interesting fomenting of the idea of can't we cooperate. It may not happen before the next election, but I think it's important to keep trying. I think there's too much at stake, and if we can The other thing, of course, it would be ideal would be to eliminate political parties. That would solve all the problems all at once. Then every MP would stand up and say, a candidate would say, vote for me because I have these values, vote for me, instead of, I represent a brand name, I'm here on behalf of a marketing team that has already done focus group testing of the blather you're about to receive from me. That's maddening. If we could eliminate political parties, I think we'd be able to rescue democracy in one fell swoop. But they're powerful, and they've got control of the system. And right now, you can't even run for office except as an independent. And by the way, if you run as an independent without a leader signing your name, his or her name, to be on the ballot as a candidate, there's a much better tax treatment of donations if you're running for Parliament for a liberal, for a recognized political party, including the Greens, than if you run as an independent, where your donations can't receive a tax receipt in advance of the election. So the system is very, very hardwired right now to favoring large political parties, even though political parties aren't mentioned in our Constitution. We don't need them. If we could get rid of political parties, that's another fast track to save democracy. My party might mind, but I think it's important to mention it. Anyway, I appreciate your time enormously. It's great to see so many people come out. You can reach me at my office in Sydney on 4th Street anytime you need anything. And for the rest of this, I will reconvene a meeting. This is a good facility. This worked well. We'll be back here sometime in January to report on the activities of the House of Commons during the fall session, whenever it begins and whenever it ends. Thank you so much for coming.